There were a few concepts that I wanted to use the whiteboard first for, excuse me. Um, oh, before I forget, I did correct that slide on your slides that had the quantity and price kind of mixed up on that. So on your slides, they're correct. Um, but I wanted to cover a few things using the whiteboard. The first of them is that even when something shifts demand or shifts supply, something that shifts supply is actually going to have an impact on consumers, and something that shifts demand is going to have an impact on producers. So we have to separate out the direct effect and then the indirect effect that goes through price changes. So let's look at an example. So let me just set up a little market here. Okay, and so we'll have price over here, quantity, our demand, and our supply. Okay, start out at equilibrium here, and that's a particular price and a particular quantity. Okay, now let's suppose we put a tax on consumers. And so a tax on consumers would have a negative effect on demand. It would decrease demand. It wouldn't have an effect on supply. Okay, it would decrease demand. And the net effect of that would be moved to point B. That's our comparative static point there. And so we'd move to a new price and a new quantity. But here's the thing, it does have an effect on producers. And so once the tax is put on consumers, it'll decrease demand, it won't change supply, but it'll cause a movement along the supply curve. So what happens is the price has fallen, and when the price falls, that'll reduce the quantity supplied. So you'll move from A to B here, and because equilibrium has moved from quantity 1 to quantity 2, the quantity supplied has also decreased. So that's a way in which producers don't like taxes on consumers. They probably like them less when they're on themselves, but they don't like them on consumers because that'll decrease their prices that they're going to actually receive, and then that'll make them actually produce less. We have a similar type thing if we move to a tax on producers. So in this case, we're again looking at supply and demand and our opening equilibrium point, our initial price, and our initial quantity. Okay. And so then we put a tax on producers, and that'll decrease supply. Remember, decreases in supplies are shifts to the left. So here's our new supply curve. Okay. And we move to point B here. And that has increased the price and decreased the quantity. So here's our new quantity, and here's our new price. But because the price went up, that's also going to have an impact on consumers. So it'll cause a movement along the demand curve. So any shift in supply will cause a movement along the demand curve, and any shift in demand will cause a movement along the supply curve. If you understand that, you're starting to get supply and demand pretty well. Okay. So that was the first thing I wanted to talk about. I also wanted to talk about the idea of a reverse question, because this also helps you understand supply and demand. And so let me start out, and I'm calling these reverse questions because you're given the answer, and then you have to figure out how you got there with a single shift. So let's suppose, let me take an example way back. This was back in the 1970s. My older brothers and sisters sent away for calculators. And I think these were TI-5s or something like that. They were Texas Instruments early version of a calculator, and they were really expensive. I think they cost almost $100, or maybe even a little more than $100. And they didn't do nearly what calculators do today, or anything that we have. So one of the things, if we start out and think about what happened over time, so they end up over time selling a lot more calculators, but also the price of them came down dramatically. So if we're starting out at point A, there's something that we realize right away. Prices come down, okay, and quantity has increased, okay? So a reverse question asks you, with a single shift, how can that happen? How can we have price come down and quantity increase? Well, we know it can't be an increase in demand, because if we got an increase in demand, okay, sort of looking at this, that would mean that price has gone up and quantity has gone up. We know that it can't be a decrease in supply, because that would be totally wrong, because that would move us to a decrease in quantity and an increase in price. We know it couldn't have been a decrease in demand, because that would mean that we'd have, yes, we'd have the price coming down, but we'd see the quantity also decreasing. So the only solution to this is what had to have happened is supply radically increased. Okay, and it moved us from point A to point B, and that meant that the price came down and the quantity increased. That's what's known as a reverse question. And if you understand those questions pretty well, I think you have a really good understanding of supply and demand. Let me do one more, okay? And that is, let's suppose that we have a situation in which we're starting out here, okay? And we know that the price and the quantity have decreased. Well, if we think about that, if we're starting out a day and we know that the price has come down, so we've gone in this direction, okay, and we know that the quantity has come down, so we've gone in this direction. Well, that means we're somewhere down here at point B, okay, and the only way to get there with a single shift is with a decrease in demand. Okay, that's a reverse question. So think those through. If you can understand those pretty well, I think you already have a pretty good understanding of supply and demand that's out there. Okay, couple other things I wanted to get into just to close things out. I wanted to look at sort of using supply and demand to think about other markets. So let me go up here, and I want to think about the Asian crisis. This was in 1996 to 1998, starts out in Thailand, and you can use markets for all sorts of different things. Sometimes the price is something else. So in this case, we're going to look at the price of the Thai baht, okay, in terms of the dollar. So it's how much of the baht, which is the Thai currency, per dollar, okay? And you have a demand for baht and a supply of baht, okay? And so if we're looking at this, we have an outcome of this particular ratio of that. That would be our exchange rate, at least as defined by the Thai perspective, okay? So that's just a price, and you have a supply and demand for this. What's weird about it is it's a supply and demand of currencies. Towards the end of the class, we're going to talk a lot about exchange rates, but it's just a supply and demand relationship, but with a twist, because the supply in this case is going to represent the amount of baht. This is the market for the baht, and so this is baht, and the demand is going to come from dollars. Okay, so dollars transforming themselves into baht on this. So if we're looking at the Asian crisis, their currency was tied to the yen, and the yen started to appreciate, started to get stronger, and so the baht became overvalued. And what happened is that you had a situation in which, because the baht was overvalued, that means it's strong relative to market conditions, that what was happening was Thai citizens were buying more foreign goods than foreigners were buying their goods. They had a current account deficit, and that increased the supply of baht in this market. Okay, but they were trying to keep their currency relatively fixed. So that means that well, if you sort of look what's going on, here is our new supply curve. So I should label this supply of the baht 2, so we know it. And so we have the same demand curve. So here's the quantity demanded for baht, and this is the quantity supplied of bot. So what we had was a surplus of bot. And so in this situation, what will happen is, you should have a movement downwards in the price of the bot. It should be worth less. But they were trying to keep it stable. And so this sort of built up pressure. And then what happened is that an awful lot of investors, George Soros and some others, sort of looked at this and said, I don't think they can keep this relationship between the bot and the dollar out there. I think that it's going to have to collapse in some respects. And so what happens in this instance is not only do you have more bot in the market like this, but the demand for the bot starts to drop. Okay, so we start going in this direction as nobody really wants to hold that. And so in this situation, what you have is a constant sort of pressure on this, and this whole system eventually snapped. And so the bot not only sort of smoothly went down, but it kind of collapsed. The point of this is to get you thinking in terms of markets, even in places where you don't see a price or you don't see ordinary things. Almost anything out there can be put in a market framework. This was two currencies together. We can also look at the price of money, which is, you have an interest rate on that because we're usually thinking about a time differential on that. So there's lots of things that we can put in a market framework that aren't ordinarily, it doesn't fit the nice, neat price on one quantity, quantity on the other. Instead, in this case, we have an exchange rate. In the other case, we'd have an interest rate, but they're all just market relationships, and you want to sort of think in this supply and demand relationship. Okay, so that's looking at some other markets that are out there. And I did want to do a little bit on price ceilings and floors. We talked a little bit about this when I was talking about the movement to equilibrium and when you intervene in that. One of the things is that when you intervene in the market, economists think there are reasons to intervene in the market. However, there's always kind of a feedback loop. Okay, it's usually not the end of the story when you intervene in the market. There's always some sort of feedback that takes place. So when you put in a restriction like a price ceiling or a price floor, that it's going to cause something like a shortage or a surplus that's out there. If you put in a quantity restriction like a quota, it's also going to cause some problems in creating shortages and surpluses that are out there. So that's the sort of lesson that comes out of this. But let's look at a situation in which we're putting a price floor in place. And in this case, I want to look at agricultural goods and think about the 1930s or so. Okay, Agricultural Adjustment Act. And so one of the things that was put in place, they had a problem. Prices were falling. So we had deflation from 1930 to 1933. Prices fell by about a third. The problem for farmers was that prices fell by 2/3 on their products like corn and wheat, and they only fell by about 6% on the products that they were buying, like tractors and those sorts of things. So this was destroying farm incomes. So what they were trying to do was intervene to try to keep, put in price supports to try to keep these prices of products to not fall too much. Okay, so here's our price floor, and here's our equilibrium price. Okay. Now, problem is, now, first of all, I should note that if this price floor were set below the equilibrium price, it wouldn't have any effect because you just reach equilibrium on that. But if the price floor is set above the equilibrium price, we'll follow this across to the demand curve, and that'll give us our quantity demanded, and then we'll follow this across to the supply curve, and that'll give us our quantity supplied. Quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded, so that's a surplus. So one of the problems is that you have a surplus. Okay, and so that's one of the inherent problems with this. And so you have all these goods around there. So one of the things they decided to do was to try to do all this in some other ways. One of them might be to try to restrict supply. So they actually, something called the Conservation Reserve Program, actually paid farmers to take land out of production. And this was about reducing supply. So you achieve the same thing. Instead of having that surplus, you move here to point A and you achieve the same thing. Now, this is difficult in the sense that what this does is restrict the supply at a time when people were destitute and didn't have enough food and those sorts of things. But the first New Deal was often about creating monopolies and restricting supply in order to keep prices from falling. Again, the problem was prices were falling and destroying family incomes of various sorts. So they're trying to figure out those ways. They tried price floors. An alternative would be to take some land out of production or create a monopoly. All these things would be about restricting supply. And then it isn't until later on that they decide that the real solution is to try to increase demand. So they give subsidies, or in other ways, even have the government buy it up, because what that does is it increases demand and moves you to B, keeping farm incomes higher, but also not creating a surplus, but also having more food availability on that. So that's a way to sort of think about these things, is that you have a problem. The problem is falling farm incomes. There are various ways of going about intervening, and intervention is probably going to have some sort of feedback loop, but what is the best way of doing it? What is the best way to fix that particular situation? So the other type of intervention that's often pursued, and I think Krugman does a good job of explaining this, and I've given you an article for the first assignment on this, is to think about price ceilings. Okay, and if we think about a price ceiling, actually price ceiling, excuse me. If we think about a price ceiling, this is when you put the price, you don't allow the price to go above a certain level. And so the classic one has always been rent control. And I have a lot of experience with rent control because I went to school in Boston and I lived in a rent control apartment for quite a period of time. And so I got into one and stayed into it for a while on that. And so here's your price ceiling here. Okay, and here's your equilibrium price. And the problem with the price ceiling is, of course, what it does is here's your quantity supplied and here's your quantity demanded, and it creates a shortage. But in Boston, I got into this place and it was hideous. It was, but it was, I think this is back in the 1980s, and I think I got into an apartment for around $238, which was far lower. Living on campus at Boston U was, I think, $480 or something like that. But I got into this rent control apartment. It was filled with roaches. It was awful, all those sorts of things. And then I made the mistake of leaving to go home to go work construction during the summer. And when I came back, I faced a 1% vacancy rate in Boston. And so I'm sort of seen both sides of the rent control, and I couldn't get in anywhere. I sort of lived on friends' couches, and actually the best place I lived was a friend over in Tufts had a very large closet. And so for I think 5 months I lived in that closet, and that was probably the best place I lived that year. I lived in another bunch of places on that. So that's the flip side, is that you have intervention on this. And what could you do? Well, you could have a subsidy, but that just sort of worsens the problem in some respects, because that just increases demand. So if you subsidize consumers, I guess you could either produce more government housing, or you could do a subsidy to producers, which would increase supply. And that's probably, just sort of thinking in a market sense, that's probably one of the better solutions on that. But that's looking at a price ceiling and the effects on that. Okay, so There are a number of ways that you can use market analysis. I think it really comes down to getting practice with it and thinking a lot of these things through. But I'll see you come next week. So.